Her husband left her nothing but a rusted shed, until her dog uncovered what he never told her. Lydia Mercer thought the shed was the last stubborn reminder of a man who kept too much to himself. It leaned crooked at the edge of her backyard, flaking rust onto dying grass in a fading Cleveland neighborhood. But the night her German shepherd refused to leave its side, scratching, whining, digging beneath the concrete, grief turned into something else. Something buried. Something waiting. Have you ever discovered something about someone you loved long after they were gone? Share a word that describes that feeling. The house had never felt this quiet. Lydia Mercer stood in the middle of her kitchen, one hand resting on the back of a wooden chair Owen had refinished 20 years ago, listening to the refrigerator hum. It was an old refrigerator, much older than it should have been, and the steady mechanical buzz used to irritate her. Now it felt like proof that something in the house still worked. Outside, the sky over the industrial corridor south of Cleveland hung low and gray. The smokestacks from the old factories, some dormant, some still coughing out thin ribbons of exhaust, rose beyond the tree line like tired sentries. The neighborhood had once been solidly middle class. Engineers, plant managers, school administrators. Now half the houses had peeling paint, and 3 on her block had foreclosure notices taped to their doors. Lydia turned 69 in March. She had retired from Brookside High School 5 years earlier after nearly 3 decades as a guidance counselor. She used to spend her days helping teenagers map out futures, college applications, trade schools, scholarships, backup plans. She had always been good at spotting potential in other people. She had not been good at preparing for the morning she woke up and found her husband cold beside her. The aneurysm had been sudden. No warning. No drawn-out hospital drama. Just a quiet end to 41 years of marriage. The doctors called it merciful. Lydia did not. Atlas padded into the kitchen, his large frame moving gently across the worn linoleum. The German shepherd's coat, once sleek and jet black along his back, now showed streaks of gray around his muzzle. He had been Owen's dog from the beginning, brought home as a squirming 8-week-old pup who chewed through 2 dining room chairs before he was housebroken. Now Atlas leaned his head against Lydia's hip. "I know," she murmured, stroking the ridge between his ears. "I miss him too." Through the back window, she could see it. The shed. It crouched at the far edge of the yard like something ashamed of itself. The corrugated metal siding had turned a mottled orange-brown from years of rust. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. One corner dipped lower than the others, as if it had given up trying to stand straight. Owen had refused to tear it down. "It's solid where it counts," he'd always said. "Ugly doesn't mean useless." She had argued every summer. The neighborhood was changing. Property values were slipping. The shed looked like something dragged from a junkyard. But Owen would just shrug, wipe his hands on his jeans, and say he'd get to it eventually. He never had. The doorbell rang. Lydia straightened, smoothing her cardigan as if she were about to greet a parent at school instead of a real estate agent she'd met only once. Atlas gave a low, uncertain huff, but didn't bark. When she opened the door, Melissa Crowley stood on the porch in sensible heels and a beige trench coat, holding a leather portfolio against her chest. Melissa was in her early 40s, bright-eyed and relentlessly optimistic, the kind of woman who described outdated kitchens as full of character. "Mrs. Mercer," Melissa said warmly. "Thank you for inviting me back." "Lydia is fine." They walked through the living room where dust motes drifted in pale afternoon light. The furniture hadn't changed positions in decades. Lydia had not moved a single chair since Owen died. It felt disloyal somehow. Melissa stepped onto the back patio and paused, and her expression shifted just slightly. "Oh," she said. Lydia crossed her arms. "Yes, the shed." Melissa tried to recover her professional tone. "Structurally, the house itself is very appealing. The brickwork is solid, the layout is timeless, but buyers today are sensitive to visible exterior issues." "You mean it's ugly?" Melissa smiled apologetically. "It lowers perceived value." Lydia followed her gaze to the rusted panels, the warped door, the creeping weeds that had begun climbing the back wall. The grass around it grew unevenly, as if the ground itself avoided the structure. We could stage it, Melissa continued gently, or remove it altogether. Clearing the yard would open up the space beautifully. Remove it. Lydia felt something tighten in her chest. Part grief, part irritation. The shed had annoyed her for years. Oh, it was impractical, outdated, stubborn, just like Owen could be. But the thought of bulldozing it felt like erasing something she didn't fully understand. I'll think about it, she said. After Melissa left, the house fell quiet again. Lydia walked to the back fence, Atlas trotting beside her. The yard smelled faintly of damp soil and distant factory smoke. The wind carried a metallic tang from the industrial lots beyond the rail line. Up close, the shed looked worse than it did from the kitchen window. Rust flaked off in thin curls near the hinges. The padlock hung loosely, though she couldn't remember the last time it had actually been locked. Owen had kept tools in there. Scrap lumber, old paint cans, things he insisted might be useful someday. Someday, she muttered. Atlas sniffed along the base of the structure. She then circled it slowly. Lydia brushed her fingers along the rough metal siding. It felt cold, brittle. This thing is going to cost me money, she told the dog, just like everything else lately. The medical bills were stacked in a drawer she hadn't opened in weeks. Property taxes were due in a month. Owen had handled most of their finances. She had trusted him with that the way he trusted her with everything else. Now trust felt abstract. Invoices did not. She stepped back and looked at the shed again. It was an eyesore, a liability, a stubborn reminder of a man who had refused to let go of things she didn't always understand. If she sold the house, the shed would have to go. If she stayed, it would need repairs. Either way, it stood there like one more problem waiting to be solved. Atlas sat down near the back corner, with his ears perked toward the structure as if listening for something inside. Lydia didn't notice. She was already walking back toward the house, the weight of decisions pressing against her ribs. Behind her, the shed remained silent. Rust clung to its frame. The roof sagged, and the yard settled back into stillness. To Lydia Mercer, it was nothing but junk. Another burden in a life that had suddenly grown too heavy to carry. The next morning arrived with a thin drizzle that streaked the kitchen window. Lydia stood at the counter with her coffee, staring at the yard as if willing it to rearrange itself into something manageable. The shed sat in the distance, darkened by rain, its rust deepened to the color of dried blood. Atlas lay at her feet, chin resting on his paws. The knock came just before noon, sharp, official, not neighborly. Opened the door to find a postal worker holding a clipboard. Certified mail for Lydia Mercer. Her name looked too formal on the electronic pad. She signed, closed the door, and stood in the foyer holding the envelope longer than necessary. The return address was from the Cuyahoga County Treasurer's office. Her pulse ticked unevenly in her throat. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat down in the chair Owen used to claim during dinner. The paper tore too easily. Inside was a printed notice, clinical and exact. Outstanding medical balances transferred to collections. Accumulated property tax penalties. A lien placed against the home. Settlement required within 30 days to avoid further legal action. 30 days. The words seemed detached from time, as if they belonged to someone else's calendar. Aunt Lydia read the notice twice, then a third time, tracing the figures with her finger. The hospital charges were higher than she remembered. There had been tests before the aneurysm, complaints of headaches Owen had brushed off, follow-up scans, consultations. She hadn't realized how much had gone unpaid. He had always said, "I've got it handled." She folded the letter slowly, aligning the edges with care, as if neatness might reduce the total. Atlas lifted his head, ears twitching. "Well," she whispered, "that's that." She pulled open the drawer where she'd been stacking unopened envelopes. Bills, statements, insurance summaries. She had told herself she would organize them once she felt steady enough to look at numbers without shaking. She wasn't steady now. The phone rang. Lydia glanced at the screen. Marissa. She let it ring once more before answering. "Hi, honey. Mom, did you talk to the realtor again?" "Yes. She came by yesterday." "And?" "She thinks the shed needs to go." A pause. You know she's right. Lydia stared at the rain collecting along the patio stones. It's not that simple. It kind of is, Marissa said gently. You can't stay there forever. The neighborhood isn't getting better, and you shouldn't be handling everything alone. Lydia resisted the urge to bristle. Her daughter lived in Columbus now, worked in marketing, moved quickly through a world that measured progress in quarterly goals and housing trends. She loved her mother fiercely, but from a practical distance. There's more, Lydia said. She explained the letter. The lien. The 30-day deadline. Marissa exhaled sharply. Mom! Oh, that's serious. I can read, Lydia replied, sharper than she intended. I didn't mean… Marissa paused, recalibrating. Listen, this is exactly why you should sell. The market's still decent. If you clear the property and stage it right, you could walk away without all this stress. There are beautiful condos downtown, secure buildings, no maintenance. No backyard, no brick walls Owen had painted himself, no shed. I'm not moving into a glass box, Lydia said quietly. Mom, I just need time. You don't have time, that's what I'm saying. The rain intensified, tapping against the window. Atlas shifted, sensing the tension in Lydia's voice. I'll figure something out, she said finally. After they hung up, the house felt smaller. She gathered the bills and spread them across the table, like a puzzle missing its corner pieces. How Owen had managed the accounts online. Passwords she didn't know. Investments she'd barely paid attention to. She had trusted him the way people trust gravity, never questioning what held everything in place. Now she saw how much of their foundation she had never inspected. Her gaze drifted again toward the backyard. The shed stood motionless in the rain, indifferent to deadlines. She felt irritation rise, unexpected and sharp. You and your projects, she muttered under her breath. Always one more thing. Owen had spent hours out there over the years. Said it helped him think. Said it was just storage. Said it wasn't worth tearing down yet. She had never pressed. Now it felt like another unanswered question. Atlas rose and walked to the back door, nails clicking softly on the floor. He stood there, watching the yard. You're not going out in that, she told him. He didn't move. She walked over and opened the door a few inches. The air smelled damp and metallic. Atlas stepped onto the patio and stood facing the shed, body still, ears angled forward. What is it? She asked, though she expected no reply. He remained fixed on the structure, rain spotting his fur. Lydia crossed her arms against the chill. The shed looked darker in the storm, its sagging roof collecting shallow pools of water. It seemed to lean toward the fence as if listening. The lean notice weighed against her palm. 30 days. The number echoed in her mind, ticking forward whether she moved or not. She closed the door and leaned her forehead briefly against the glass. Behind her, bills lay scattered across the table. Ahead, the yard stretched toward the one structure she had always dismissed as useless. The house felt like a map she no longer knew how to read. And somewhere in that quiet, the pressure began to build. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the yard heavy and dark. Lydia hadn't slept well. The number, 30 days, looped through her mind in steady rotation, as persistent as the refrigerator hum downstairs. She rose before sunrise, pulled on a cardigan, and walked barefoot into the kitchen. Atlas was already awake. He stood near the back door, rigid, staring through the glass. You're up early, she murmured. He didn't turn toward her voice. Outside, the backyard looked different after the storm. Patches of soil near the fence were darker, soaked through. Water pooled in shallow depressions along the patio. The shed, and streaked with fresh rain lines, looked even more fragile in the pale morning light. Atlas let out a low whine. Lydia frowned. What's gotten into you? She poured coffee and tried to ignore him, but the sound came again. Short, restless. When she opened the door, Atlas bolted outside before she could clip his leash. Atlas! He didn't run wild the way he sometimes did. He moved with purpose, crossing the yard directly toward the shed. His nose lowered to the ground. He circled once, twice, then stopped at the back corner where the structure met the fence. He began pawing at the dirt. Lydia exhaled sharply. Rodents, she said aloud. That's all. Atlas scratched harder, soil spraying behind him. The ground had softened from the rain. Within seconds, he had carved a shallow trench along the shed's foundation. Enough, she called, then walking toward him. He ignored her. His tail stiffened. His breathing grew louder, focused. He pressed his nose into the loosened earth and let out a sharp bark, once, twice, then resumed digging with renewed urgency. Lydia felt a flicker of irritation. Atlas, stop it! She reached for his collar, but he shifted sideways, not aggressive, just unwilling to leave. He whined, pawed again, then barked directly at the base of the shed. The sound echoed strangely against the metal siding. Lydia paused. She had never seen him behave like this, not even as a puppy. Atlas had always been disciplined, steady. Owen used to joke that the dog had a better work ethic than half the engineers he'd supervised. He thinks there's something, Owen had once said when Atlas alerted to a loose stair tread in the basement. And he'd been right, when Lydia crouched carefully beside the disturbed patch of soil. Rainwater had washed away part of the dirt along the concrete edge beneath the shed wall. What she had assumed was a solid slab now showed a faint seam, a narrow line where two sections met unevenly. Atlas pawed again, directly at that seam. Hold on, she said softly. She brushed mud away with her hand. The soil came off easily, revealing more of the crack. It wasn't random weather damage. The line ran straight, deliberate. Atlas barked again, sharper this time, then looked at her as if expecting instruction. Her heartbeat picked up. Okay, she whispered. She stood and walked back toward the garage. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil and old cardboard. She scanned the wall until she found what she needed, a crowbar Owen had kept hanging near the workbench, and her hands felt unsteady as she returned to the shed. Atlas stepped aside the moment she approached the cracked edge. You better be right about this, she murmured to him. She wedged the flat end of the crowbar into the seam and leaned her weight against it. Nothing. She adjusted her footing and pushed harder. The metal tool groaned softly against the concrete. The slab shifted, just barely. Atlas barked once, tail high. Lydia's pulse quickened. She repositioned the crowbar and tried again. This time, the edge lifted a fraction of an inch. Mud flaked away as the slab loosened. This doesn't make sense, she muttered. Owen had never mentioned foundation repairs. She would have remembered. She pulled again, bracing her foot against the shed wall for leverage. The slab gave way with a muted crack, and tilting upward enough to reveal darkness beneath. Atlas lunged forward, squeezing his nose into the opening before she could stop him. Careful! He disappeared halfway under the shed, shoulders wriggling through the gap. Lydia dropped to her knees in the mud, heart pounding in her throat. Atlas, get back here! Instead of retreating, he barked, short and sharp, echoing from underneath the structure. Not the excited bark of chasing a squirrel. An alert. Lydia lay flat against the damp ground and peered into the narrow space. It smelled of earth and old wood. She couldn't see much from this angle, just beams, shadow, and something darker wedged between two supports. Atlas, she called gently. He barked again, closer now to the object. Lydia reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her phone, and the flashlight beam cut into the darkness beneath the shed. And there it was. Not debris, not animal remains. A shape too clean, too defined. Rectangular. Sealed. Something wrapped in waterproof material, carefully positioned between the foundation beams. Lydia's breath caught. What is that? She whispered. Atlas backed out slowly, eyes bright, chest rising and falling with controlled intensity. He didn't look frightened. He looked expectant. The shed creaked faintly in the breeze. Mud clung to Lydia's sleeves as she shifted closer to the opening. The flashlight beam trembled in her hand, but the object didn't disappear. It was real, and it had not been placed there by accident. She swallowed hard. The shed no longer looked like junk. It looked like something waiting. Lydia lay in the wet grass, heart pounding, and staring into the narrow crawl space beneath the structure. The beam from her phone trembled across the beams and dirt until it settled again on the rectangular shape wedged carefully between two supports. It wasn't trash. It wasn't random. It had been placed there. "Atlas," she whispered. The German shepherd hovered close beside her, body tense but quiet. Mud streaked his front legs from digging. His ears were angled forward, alert but not alarmed. Lydia inhaled slowly, then reached into the opening as far as her arm would allow. The ground beneath the shed was colder than she expected. Damp soil pressed against her sleeve. Her fingers brushed the object. Plastic. Heavy duty. She shifted onto her side and pushed herself farther in, ignoring the mud soaking through her jeans. Atlas leaned close but didn't interfere. Okay. Her fingertips hooked around one corner. The object was heavier than she anticipated. She pulled inch by inch, scraping it free from the tight space. When it finally slid out into the open, Lydia sat back on her heels. It was a waterproof storage container. Military grade. The kind used for sensitive equipment. Dark gray, sealed tight. No visible markings on the outside. Her pulse roared in her ears. She wiped her muddy hands on the grass and stared at it as if it might disappear. "Owen," she murmured. Atlas nudged the container gently with his nose. Lydia swallowed and lifted the lid latches one at a time. They snapped open with crisp mechanical clicks that sounded too loud in the quiet yard. She hesitated. Then she opened it. Inside lay a stack of sealed documents in clear plastic sleeves, and a small black flash drive. And on top, resting neatly across everything else, a folded sheet of paper. Her name was written on the outside in Owen's handwriting. The sight of it knocked the air from her lungs. The letters were firm, steady, not rushed, not desperate. She sat there in the mud for several seconds, staring at the familiar script. The world around her felt strangely distant. The distant hum of traffic from the industrial road, the faint rustle of wind through the chain-link fence. Atlas settled beside her, lowering himself into the grass as if standing guard. Lydia opened the note carefully. The paper was dry, preserved by the sealed container. The ink hadn't faded. "Lydia, if Atlas ever shows you this, it means the time is right. I didn't want you involved unless you had to be. I hoped I'd solve it before it reached you. But if you're reading this, then I didn't. You deserve to know what's beneath us." "Oh." Her hands began to shake. "What does that mean?" she whispered. She read the note again, slower this time. "You deserve to know what's beneath us." The words echoed in her mind, unsettling and precise. Lydia turned back to the container and began lifting out the plastic sleeves. Inside were photographs, printed and dated, aerial shots of their neighborhood, close-ups of soil trenches, images of rusted barrels partially buried underground. Her breath grew shallow. These weren't old family memories. They were evidence. She set the photos aside and pulled out the next set of documents. Engineering diagrams, survey maps, property boundary overlays, pages filled with notes in Owen's handwriting, and annotated in the margins with calculations and references to soil composition reports. She flipped through the first few pages. Arden Chemical Plant. The name triggered a faint memory. The old factory that once sat 3 blocks over, shut down in the late 1990s after a bankruptcy filing. It had been dormant for years, surrounded by fencing and faded warning signs. Recently, banners had gone up announcing Arden redevelopment, luxury urban living coming soon. Lydia's stomach tightened. She reached for the flash drive, turning it over in her fingers as if it might burn her. "Owen," she breathed again, but this time her voice carried confusion instead of grief. Atlas lifted his head at the sound of her tone. She scanned the rest of the container quickly, trying to make sense of it. There were dated inspection logs, most environmental assessment summaries, copies of correspondence addressed to city offices, none of which she recognized. All of it organized, cataloged, intentional. Her husband had not been storing old tools in this shed. He had been hiding something. The breeze shifted, brushing cold air across her face. Lydia realized she was still kneeling in the mud. Her knees ached, but she didn't move. If Atlas ever shows you this, she looked at the dog. You knew? She asked softly. Atlas tilted his head slightly, then rested his chin on her thigh. The shed loomed behind her, silent but no longer meaningless. The sagging roof, the rusted panels, the patch of disturbed earth. It had never been random. Lydia carefully repacked the contents into the container, leaving the note in her hand. She stood slowly, muscles stiff, and carried the box toward the house. Every step felt different now. The yard looked the same. The factories still lined the horizon. The distant smokestacks still bled faint exhaust into the sky. But the ground beneath her feet no longer felt ordinary. Inside the kitchen, she set the container on the table beside the unopened bills. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring at both piles. The past she had ignored, and the secret she had just uncovered. Atlas lay down beside the table, eyes fixed on her. Lydia unfolded Owen's note one more time. You deserve to know what's beneath us. Her throat tightened. The shed had not been junk. It had been a vault. And whatever Owen had hidden inside it was not small. It was deliberate. And it was meant for her. Lydia sat at the kitchen table long after the rain clouds thinned, and afternoon light filtered through the curtains. The waterproof container lay open beside her, its contents spread across the worn oak surface where she and Owen had eaten thousands of meals. Atlas remained at her feet, unusually still. She slid one of the photographs closer. It showed a trench cut through dirt not far from their street. She recognized the cracked sidewalk in the background. Inside the trench were rusted metal drums stacked horizontally, half buried, their tops corroded. The date stamped in the corner read 1998. Another photo showed workers in protective suits near the old Arden chemical plant before it shut down. And a third displayed a hand-drawn overlay marking underground pipelines and burial zones extending beyond the factory's original property line. Extending beneath residential blocks, including theirs. Her stomach tightened. She lifted one of the engineering reports. Owen's handwriting ran across the margins in careful, precise lines. Soil samples indicate benzene concentration above EPA threshold. Groundwater seepage likely underreported. Barrels relocated after closure, not fully removed. Her fingers trembled. Owen had been a structural engineer for decades, consulting on municipal projects and private builds. He had a habit of double-checking numbers, questioning assumptions. It was one of the traits she admired most about him. But he had never once mentioned this. Not during dinner. Not during the late-night news. Not even when the redevelopment signs went up 3 months ago, advertising luxury townhomes and green spaces. She plugged the flash drive into her laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dim kitchen. Folders appeared. Arden soil reports. City correspondence. Exemption filings. Photographic evidence. Her breath felt shallow. She opened the first folder. Scanned documents filled the screen. Copies of environmental assessments from the early 2000s. Several pages were highlighted digitally. Owen's annotations explained inconsistencies between official reports and independent testing he had apparently commissioned quietly through contacts in the industry. There were letters addressed to city officials, drafts of formal complaints that appeared never to have been sent. And then she opened a video file. Now it showed Owen standing in what looked like the basement of the shed. The camera angle was slightly tilted, as if propped against a toolbox. His hair was thinner than she remembered in the early years, lines deeper around his eyes. He cleared his throat. If you're watching this, Lydia, it means I didn't finish. Her heart stopped. He looked straight into the lens. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you carrying this with me. But Arden buried waste under half this neighborhood before they shut down. I found the old maps during a structural review in '97. They altered the public filings. I've been collecting proof ever since. He paused, eyes lowering briefly. They're redeveloping the site now. Luxury housing. If they build without full remediation, families will move on to contaminated ground. And if anyone files an objection within the legal window, the whole exemption collapses. Lydia pressed a hand to her mouth. I thought I'd have time, Owen continued softly. Time to finish the case properly. Time to file it clean and protect everyone here, including you. I didn't want retaliation. These companies don't like noise. The video ended abruptly. Silence filled the kitchen. Atlas shifted, sensing her distress. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered at the empty screen. Her mind reeled. All those evenings he spent in the shed. All the times she'd teased him about his projects. The countless Saturdays he said he needed to double-check something. He hadn't been tinkering. He had been building a case. She opened another file, financial records of soil testing. She paid quietly from a separate account she hadn't known existed. Modest amounts, spread over years. Nothing extravagant. Just steady, methodical work. She scrolled further. A final document caught her eye. A map overlay highlighting residential parcels, including her own address. Red shading marked beneath their yard. Her chest tightened so sharply she had to grip the edge of the table. "Beneath us," she murmured. Owen's words in the note returned with new weight. "You deserve to know what's beneath us." Atlas rose and placed his head on her knee. She looked around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. The tiled floor, the brick foundation visible through the basement window, the yard beyond. Had they been living above buried contamination for decades? Her gaze drifted toward the shed. It hadn't been camouflage for junk, unless it had been camouflage for evidence. Lydia stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the old Arden site loomed in the distance beyond rows of houses. Construction cranes had recently appeared there, skeletal shapes against the skyline. Luxury banners flapped in the wind. She thought of young families signing contracts, of children playing in newly landscaped yards. Her breath grew steadier. Owen hadn't been hoarding secrets for selfish reasons. He had been protecting something larger than himself, and he had nearly finished. Her eyes moved back to the lien notice still lying on the table. 30 days. Suddenly, the deadline felt different. Not just financial pressure. A clock. She returned to the laptop and opened the exemption filings folder. Inside were copies of a municipal environmental exemption granted years ago, allowing redevelopment without full remediation under specific conditions. Owen's notes circled key language in red. Objection window. 60 days from notice of redevelopment. If formal environmental challenge filed, then exemption void. Her pulse quickened. She checked the redevelopment announcement date online. 46 days ago. That left 2 weeks, she whispered. Atlas lifted his head again at the shift in her voice. Lydia leaned back in the chair, absorbing the magnitude of it. Her husband had been preparing to challenge a powerful redevelopment project. He had gathered proof quietly, meticulously. He had built the groundwork for something explosive. And then he died, leaving it unfinished, leaving it buried beneath a shed she almost demolished. The grief that had weighed on her chest since his death shifted into something sharper. Not anger. Clarity. Owen hadn't hidden this from her out of distrust. He had hidden it because he believed he could finish it himself. She reached down and stroked Atlas's fur. "You showed me," she said softly. The German shepherd's tail tapped once against the floor. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the industrial road. The world moved as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The shed was no longer an embarrassment. It was evidence. And what Owen had left behind was no longer just a secret. It was a responsibility. The word settled heavily in Lydia's chest. Responsibility meant action, and action meant exposure. She sat in the quiet kitchen as afternoon light faded into evening. The flash drive remained plugged into her laptop. Manahu Atlas lay near her chair, his presence solid and steady, as if he understood that something irreversible had shifted. If she ignored the evidence, she could still sell the house, pay off the lien, move to a condo, leave the industrial skyline behind. But the red shading beneath her address on Owen's map pulsed in her mind like a warning. She reached for her phone and searched for environmental attorneys in Cleveland. Names appeared. Firms with polished websites and confident slogans, most specialized in corporate compliance or regulatory defense. She scrolled further. One name caught her attention. Marcus Velasquez, Environmental Litigation and Community Advocacy. His profile described him as having represented neighborhoods in soil contamination cases tied to industrial sites. Former EPA consultant, licensed in Ohio. So she hesitated before dialing. When the call connected, his voice was calm, measured. Velasquez Law. "My name is Lydia Mercer," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not sure if this is your area, but I believe I have documentation related to environmental contamination near the old Arden chemical site." There was a brief pause. "That is my area," he replied. "What kind of documentation?" "My husband was a structural engineer. He collected soil reports and photographic evidence over many years. He believed toxic waste was buried under surrounding residential blocks." Another pause, longer this time. "And your husband?" "He passed away last year." "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Marcus's tone shifted slightly, more focused. "Mrs. Mercer, Arden's redevelopment has already begun preliminary grading. Well, if what you're describing is legitimate, timing matters. Can you email me a few sample documents?" "I can," she said, glancing at the laptop. "Don't forward everything yet. Just enough for verification. And don't share it widely until we confirm authenticity." A chill ran down her spine. "Why?" "Because projects like this involve powerful financial interests. If there's credible evidence, it will attract attention, not all of it friendly." Lydia swallowed. "I understand." She ended the call and sat very still. Atlas rose and walked to the front window, his ears lifting slightly. A car drove slowly down the street. Probably nothing. Still, the sight unsettled her. She emailed scanned copies of 3 soil reports and 2 annotated maps to Marcus Velasquez. Then she closed the laptop and waited. Oh, the house felt different now. Not just quiet, but aware. Night settled in layers. The streetlights outside flickered on one by one. Atlas refused to settle into his usual spot near the couch. Instead, he positioned himself near the front door, head raised. Lydia watched him from the kitchen. "You sense it too?" she murmured. Her phone vibrated. An email. She opened it. The subject line read, "Preliminary review. Urgent." Her heart thudded. "Mrs. Mercer, the documents appear authentic. Soil contamination levels shown in these reports exceed EPA safety thresholds for residential development. If these findings are accurate and current, redevelopment should not proceed without remediation. There is also reference to a municipal environmental exemption filed years ago. I will need to verify whether that exemption remains valid. But we should meet as soon as possible. Marcus Velasquez." Her breath caught. Authentic. The word rang in her ears. This was not paranoia, not speculation. Owen had been right. She leaned back in her chair, pressing her palm to her chest. "What were you carrying all those years?" she whispered into the empty room. Atlas's nails clicked against the hardwood as he repositioned himself closer to her. The next morning, she drove downtown to Marcus Velasquez's office, a modest brick building nestled between 2 renovated warehouses. Cleveland's skyline loomed in the distance, steel and glass rising above the river. She carried the waterproof container with both hands. Inside the office, Marcus was younger than she expected. Early 40s, sharp-eyed, but not severe. His handshake was firm, respectful. They sat across from each other at a polished wooden table. He reviewed the documents carefully, page by page. Occasionally, he asked precise questions. "Your husband commissioned these soil tests independently?" "Yes." "Do you know which lab?" "The names are in his notes." He nodded. "The exemption referenced here," Marcus continued, pointing to a highlighted paragraph, "allowed Arden to bypass full remediation based on a claim that buried materials were removed during closure. Your husband's evidence suggests otherwise." Lydia folded her hands tightly in her lap. "What happens if we file an objection?" Marcus met her eyes directly. "If filed within the statutory window, the redevelopment pauses. State environmental regulators must reassess the site. Oh, it becomes public record. And the company? They won't be pleased." The words were not dramatic, just factual. She thought of the banners advertising luxury townhomes, of the smiling models on the renderings, of the money already invested. "And if we don't file?" He hesitated. "Construction continues." Silence stretched between them. Marcus closed the folder. "Mrs. Mercer, I need to be candid. This kind of action places you at the center of a legal dispute. Developers sometimes respond aggressively, not illegally, but with pressure. Buyout offers. Persuasion. The word hung there. Pressure. She had already felt it from the lien notice, from Marissa's insistence that she sell. Now it expanded outward. I don't want attention, she said quietly. Then the easiest path is to sell your property and move. The suggestion landed like a stone. She imagined packing up the house, leaving the shed, leaving the buried evidence. She imagined Owen watching that decision from wherever he was. Her voice came out softer than she expected. My husband didn't hide this to scare anyone. He hid it to protect people. Marcus studied her for a moment. Then we need to move carefully. He outlined next steps: verification of the exemption timeline, formal filing procedures, coordination with state environmental officials, legal language, deadlines, documentation. Atlas waited in the car outside. When Lydia stepped back onto the sidewalk, the air felt sharper. The wind carried the scent of the river and distant industry. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. She ignored it. So as she drove home, she noticed something she hadn't before. Billboards advertising Arden redevelopment dotted the roadside. Green lawns, clean sidewalks, smiling couples strolling with coffee cups. Modern living rooted in history. The slogan made her grip the steering wheel tighter. When she pulled into her driveway, a black sedan idled briefly at the corner before driving on. Probably nothing. Still, Atlas was waiting at the door before she even reached it, tail low but alert. Inside, she set the container back on the kitchen table. The house was the same. The shed still rusted quietly in the yard. But the truth she now carried felt heavier than the lien notice ever had. Anxiety crept in where revelation had stood the day before. Because now the secret was no longer buried. It was moving. And movement created ripples. On the next afternoon, Lydia stood at the kitchen sink rinsing a coffee mug she hadn't finished. Her nerves had settled into something quieter, but heavier. A constant awareness humming beneath every thought. Atlas was positioned near the front window again. The knock came precisely at 2:17 p.m. 3 measured taps. Not hesitant, not aggressive. Lydia dried her hands and walked to the door. Through the frosted glass, she could make out the outline of a woman in a tailored coat. She opened it cautiously. Mrs. Mercer? The woman asked, her smile polished and effortless. Yes. My name is Claire Benton. I represent Arden Redevelopment. I believe you've seen our signage in the neighborhood. The name sent a small jolt through Lydia's chest, though she kept her face neutral. Yes, I've seen it. Claire stepped slightly to the side, not as if presenting the street itself as evidence. We're very excited about the revitalization plans for this area. New housing, retail space, a cleaner future for this block. Lydia folded her arms loosely. I'm sure. Claire's eyes drifted briefly toward the backyard. Not lingering, just enough. We've been reaching out to select homeowners in proximity to the initial construction phase. Your property is adjacent to a primary access route we'll be improving. Improving, Lydia repeated. Expanding road capacity, upgrading utilities, the usual. Atlas moved into the hallway behind Lydia, his large frame visible now in the doorway. Claire's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Beautiful dog, she said. He's protective. I can see that. Claire adjusted the folder in her hand. We're prepared to offer you $180,000 for immediate purchase of your home. That's well above current market value, especially considering structural elements like outbuildings. Her eyes flicked again toward the yard, the shed. Lydia felt her pulse steady rather than spike. That's generous, she said calmly. We believe in fair transitions, and with the coming construction, traffic patterns may become inconvenient. Property aesthetics could shift temporarily. Temporarily? Atlas stepped forward slightly. A low rumble vibrated in his chest. Not a bark, a warning. Claire's posture remained composed, but her fingers tightened on the folder. We'd handle closing costs. Fast timeline. Clean transaction. How fast? Lydia asked. Within 2 weeks, if necessary. 2 weeks. The same amount of time Marcus had said remained in the objection window. Lydia kept her breathing even. That's sudden, she said. Opportunity often is, Claire replied smoothly. We've identified a handful of homes whose acquisition would streamline redevelopment logistics. Streamline. The word felt surgical. Lydia tilted her head slightly. Why my home specifically? Location, Claire said. Proximity to infrastructure. And the shed? Lydia asked lightly. Claire's smile didn't falter. Frankly, removing aging auxiliary structures would improve overall land grading efficiency. Atlas let out a deeper growl this time. Atlas, Lydia said quietly, though she did not move to restrain him. Claire shifted her weight. Mrs. Mercer, I understand this neighborhood has sentimental value, but the area is evolving. And if you wait too long, market conditions could shift. Offers like this don't remain open indefinitely. There it was. The edge beneath the politeness. Lydia felt something unexpected rise inside her. Not fear, not yet. Suspicion hardened into certainty. You're in a hurry, she said. Claire met her eyes directly now. We're on a timeline. So am I, Lydia replied. Silence stretched between them. Claire opened the folder and slid a printed document partially forward, just enough for Lydia to see the bolded number. $180,000. Consider it, Claire said softly. We'll check back in a few days. She turned smoothly and walked toward a sleek sedan parked along the curb. Atlas remained rigid until the car disappeared down the street. Lydia closed the door slowly. Her hands were steady. 2 weeks. Immediate purchase. To streamline redevelopment logistics. She walked into the kitchen and sat down, staring at the wall for a long moment. They know, she murmured. Atlas approached and rested his head on her knee. She reached for her phone and dialed Marcus. They offered to buy my house, she said without preamble. How much? Marcus asked. Double market value. A quiet exhale on the other end. That confirms urgency, he said. They are consolidating properties near sensitive zones. Likely areas tied to underlying soil issues, he finished carefully. It suggests they may be aware of potential exposure. Her stomach tightened. So they're trying to clear obstacles? Yes. And I'm an obstacle. A pause. Yes. The word landed heavily. What happens if I accept? She asked. If you sell before filing an objection, you lose standing as a property owner in the affected zone. Standing. Power. Atlas shifted closer. And if I refuse? You remain positioned to file. Lydia looked toward the backyard window. The shed stood exactly where it had always stood. Rusted. Sagging. Ordinary to anyone who didn't know. But now it was something else entirely. Claire's offer wasn't kindness. It was containment. I'm not selling, Lydia said quietly. Then we move forward carefully, Marcus replied. She ended the call and leaned back in her chair. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose metal on the shed's siding. The sound no longer annoyed her. It sounded like resistance. Atlas walked to the front window again, watching the empty street with focused intensity. Lydia felt tension coil in her chest. Not chaotic fear, but tightening awareness. The offer had been generous on paper, but generosity rarely arrived with urgency attached. She rose and walked to the back door, stepping onto the patio. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. The shed looked different again. Not embarrassing. Not burdensome. Guarded. Atlas stood beside her, scanning the perimeter. I'm not leaving, she said softly to the structure. The wind moved through the fence. Somewhere in the distance, construction equipment clanged against steel. The game had shifted, and now they were watching her. Lydia slept lightly that night, waking at every passing set of headlights. Atlas never left the front hallway. He lay stretched across the narrow space between the door and the living room, as if instinctively blocking entry. By morning, the unease had hardened into focus. She drove downtown again to meet Marcus Velasquez, this time carrying only a folder of highlighted documents. The sky over Cleveland was bright but cold, the kind of clear blue that made the industrial smokestacks look sharper against the horizon. Marcus had already pulled municipal records by the time she arrived. They moved quickly, offering to buy you out, he said, sliding a printed packet across the conference table, which made me curious about the timing. Lydia leaned forward. These are archived filings from when Arden Chemical shut down in 1999, Marcus continued. They applied for what's called a conditional environmental exemption. She frowned. Oh, meaning? Meaning the state allowed redevelopment without full hazardous remediation, provided no formal environmental objections were filed within a specified window once redevelopment was announced. Lydia's pulse quickened. What window? Marcus tapped a paragraph highlighted in yellow. 60 days from public notice of redevelopment intent. She felt her throat tighten. That was 46 days ago, she whispered. Marcus nodded. Which leaves 14 days. The room seemed to tilt slightly. 14 days to file an official environmental objection, he said. If no objection is filed, the exemption becomes fully enforceable and the project moves forward legally protected. And Owen knew this. Marcus met her eyes. Your husband annotated this clause multiple times. Well, he was preparing to challenge it. Lydia stared at the paper. Owen's handwriting circled key phrases in red ink. Objection voids exemption. Triggers state review. Must submit before window closes. Her hands trembled. Not from fear this time, but urgency. He was close, she murmured. Yes, Marcus replied quietly. Very. She looked at him sharply. What happens if we miss it? Then redevelopment proceeds without immediate environmental review. You could still litigate later, but it becomes far more complex and costly. So the offer wasn't generosity. No, Marcus said. It was timing. The word hung between them like a ticking clock. Lydia leaned back in her chair. 14 days, she repeated. Marcus slid another document toward her. I've begun drafting a formal objection based on the evidence your husband gathered. But I need sworn affidavits confirming the authenticity of his soil reports and the chain of custody for these documents. I can provide that. We'll also need to notify affected homeowners if possible. The more voices, the stronger the filing. Lydia's mind raced. Her neighbors. Many had lived there decades. Some had complained quietly about soil that wouldn't grow vegetables. Others about unexplained illnesses years ago. Owen carried this alone, she said softly. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Sometimes engineers think they can fix everything quietly, he said finally. She looked down at the highlighted clause again. 14 days. The clock had not started when she found the container. It had started weeks before, and it was nearly out. Outside the office window, construction cranes were visible across the river, skeletal arms suspended over the Arden site. They were already preparing foundations. We file, she said firmly. Marcus nodded once. I'll finalize the draft today. We should submit no later than day 58 to avoid last-minute interference. Interference. The word settled heavily. As Lydia left the office, she noticed a white SUV parked across the street. The driver appeared to be looking at his phone. When she reached her car, the SUV pulled away slowly. Probably coincidence. Still, Atlas's presence felt even more necessary when she returned home. He met her at the door, tail wagging, but posture alert. She knelt beside him. 14 days, she said softly into his fur. The backyard looked unchanged. The shed stood quiet, its rust glowing faintly in the afternoon sun. But everything around it now carried urgency. She stepped inside the shed for the first time since retrieving the container. The air smelled of old wood and metal. Dust motes floated in slanted light. Owen's old workbench still held scattered screws and measuring tools. She ran her fingers across the surface, imagining him standing there late at night, reviewing maps under a single hanging bulb. You almost did it, she whispered. Atlas stood in the doorway watching. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marissa. Mom, Claire Benton from Arden left a voicemail for me. How did she get my number? Lydia's breath caught. She typed back slowly. Did she mention why? Just said she wanted to discuss transition options. Mom, what's going on? Lydia stared at the screen. Pressure. They were widening the circle. She called her daughter immediately. I'll speak to them, Lydia said firmly once Marissa answered. Not yet. Mom, why are they contacting me? Because I didn't say yes. Silence on the other end. "Mom, what have you gotten into?" Lydia closed her eyes briefly. "Something your father started," she said. She didn't elaborate. Not yet. After ending the call, she stepped outside again. The industrial wind carried faint metallic scents from the direction of Arden's property. The banners advertising modern living fluttered against chain-link fencing. 14 days. The timeline pressed against her ribs like a physical weight, but alongside the urgency was something else. Clarity. Owen had not hidden a secret for profit or paranoia. He had hidden a deadline. Atlas moved to her side, scanning the street beyond the fence. "We're not done," she said quietly. The cranes in the distance continued their slow rotation against the sky, but now she could hear something else beneath the wind. The ticking. It followed her into the house. 14 days had shrunk to 13 by morning. Lydia barely noticed the sunrise. She was reviewing affidavits Marcus had drafted, signing where instructed, scanning additional pages Owen had annotated years ago. Atlas lay at her feet, but didn't sleep. Every time a car slowed outside, his head lifted. At 10:12 a.m., the first call came. Unknown number. She let it ring. It rang again immediately. She answered. A man's voice, low and casual. "Mrs. Mercer, you should reconsider the offer. Construction gets complicated when people make things difficult." Her spine stiffened. "Who is this?" A pause. "Just someone offering advice." The line disconnected. Lydia stood very still in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear long after the silence returned. Atlas rose, stepping closer, ears angled forward. "It's nothing," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. She moved to the front window. A delivery truck rolled past. Nothing unusual, but the air felt tighter. She tried to return to paperwork, but the ticking in her mind had shifted rhythm. That afternoon, she stepped outside to retrieve her mail. The mailbox door hung crooked, bent outward. The small red flag snapped loosely in the wind. Her stomach dropped. She opened it carefully. Inside were crumpled envelopes and a scrap of paper with no writing. Just a blank sheet torn down the middle. Not a threat, just a message. Atlas growled low beside her. She scanned the street. Across the way, the curtains moved slightly in a neighbor's window. A lawnmower hummed faintly 2 houses down. Ordinary sounds layered over something not ordinary at all. She carried the damaged mailbox door into the garage and set it on the workbench. Owen's old tools still hung neatly above it. For a moment, her hands trembled. She imagined him discovering this. Imagined the fury that would have flashed in his eyes. Not explosive anger, controlled, focused. She exhaled slowly. Fear pressed against her ribs, sharper than before. Not fear for herself, for Marissa, for Atlas, for the unknown boundaries of whoever was trying to contain this. Her phone buzzed again. A voicemail notification. She pressed play. "Mrs. Mercer, this is Claire Benton. I understand you've been consulting legal counsel. I'd strongly encourage reconsideration of our offer, Mom, before the unnecessary complications arise. My number remains the same." The tone was still polished, but urgency had thickened beneath it. Lydia deleted the message and called Marcus. "They've started," she said without preamble. He listened as she described the call and the mailbox. "Document everything," he said calmly. "Photographs, dates, times." "Is this legal?" she asked. "Intimidation without explicit threats is hard to prosecute, but it's strategic." Atlas began pacing toward the front door again. "They contacted my daughter too," Lydia added. Marcus's silence lasted a beat too long. "That escalates concern," he said carefully. "We should accelerate filing." "How fast?" "I can submit within 48 hours. She glanced at the calendar pinned to the refrigerator. Day 52. 8 days left in the official window. "Do it," she said. After the call ended, she sat at the kitchen table staring at the walls. The house felt different now, not just quiet, but exposed. For the first time since Owen's death, doubt crept in. What if she walked away? What if she accepted the offer, paid off the lien, moved somewhere safe? What if she protected Marissa from whatever this was becoming? She closed her eyes. Atlas came to her side and rested his chin on her knee again, the same way he had when she found the container. "You don't get scared, do you?" she whispered. His tail thumped once against the cabinet. That evening, headlights slowed outside again. A dark sedan idled briefly across the street before moving on. Atlas stood rigid until it disappeared. her.Lydia turned off the living room lights earlier than usual. She carried the waterproof container from the closet, where she had hidden it, and set it back on the table. She ran her fingers across its surface. "Owen," she said softly, "you carried this alone." She imagined the weight he must have felt, collecting evidence quietly while eating dinner at this same table, watching the old Arden property sit idle, knowing what lay beneath. Fear pressed harder now, but alongside it, something steadier began to form. Understanding. If they were pushing this hard, the evidence mattered. If they were contacting her daughter, the deadline mattered. If they were breaking mailboxes without leaving words, they were worried. Atlas lifted his head suddenly, ears alert. Another car rolled slowly down the street. Lydia walked to the window, but this time she did not flinch. Let them watch. She wasn't the one hiding something underground. She turned back to the table and opened Owen's folder again. The highlighted clause glowed under the kitchen light. Objection voids exemption. 8 days. Her fear did not vanish. It sharpened into resolve. Atlas settled near the front door once more, silent sentinel. The ticking had grown louder, but so had her determination. 3 days later, Marcus filed the formal environmental objection with the state. The document was 27 pages long, supported by Owen's soil reports, photographs, and sworn statements. The submission triggered an automatic review. It also triggered attention. Within hours of filing, Lydia received 2 calls from unknown numbers and one from a local news reporter asking for comment. Now, she declined all of them. Marcus called that evening. "They've scheduled a public town hall regarding redevelopment progress," he said. "Tomorrow night. Likely damage control." Lydia stared at the phone. And your filing will be addressed. They may attempt to minimize it." She felt her pulse steady in a way it hadn't since this began. "I'll be there," she said. The community center sat 2 miles from her house. A low brick building with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs arranged in tight rows. A banner hung behind the stage. Arden Redevelopment, building a cleaner future. Lydia arrived early. Atlas rode in the back seat but remained in the car with the windows cracked and water set out. She had considered leaving him home, but something about the evening made her want him nearby. The room filled quickly. Residents from the surrounding blocks, some curious, some skeptical, a few with visible frustration etched into their expressions. At the front, Claire Benton stood beside 2 men in tailored suits and a city council representative. Claire spotted Lydia almost immediately. Their eyes met. Claire's smile remained polished, but tighter. The meeting began with slides projected onto a screen, renderings of townhomes, parks, retail spaces, statistics about economic revitalization. When the slide labeled "Environmental Compliance" appeared, Claire took the microphone. "We are aware of a recently filed objection regarding historical site conditions," she said evenly. "We want to assure residents that Arden Redevelopment has adhered to all legal and environmental standards." Murmurs rippled through the room. Lydia felt her heartbeat in her throat. Claire continued, "The exemption granted in 2001 remains valid under state law." Marcus, seated 2 rows behind Lydia, leaned forward. "It remains valid pending review," he said calmly. Heads turned. Claire's smile stiffened. "The review is procedural," she replied. "There is no confirmed contamination." Lydia rose before she fully realized she had decided to stand. Her knees trembled, but only briefly. "My husband confirmed it," she said, her voice carrying farther than she expected. The room quieted. Claire turned fully toward her. "Mrs. Mercer," she said smoothly, "we appreciate your concern." Lydia stepped into the aisle, papers in hand. "Owen Mercer was a structural engineer for 32 years, she continued. "He collected soil samples across this neighborhood over a decade. On independent labs confirmed benzene and industrial solvent levels above residential safety limits. A murmur spread through the crowd. One of the suited men leaned toward Claire and whispered something. Lydia's voice did not rise in volume. It steadied. He didn't tell me because he was trying to finish the legal work himself. He believed families deserved to know what was under their homes. An older man near the back stood slowly. My wife's been sick for years, he said. Doctors couldn't explain it. Another voice chimed in. Our garden stopped growing tomatoes 20 years ago. Soil turned strange. The room shifted. It was no longer a presentation. It was a conversation. Claire lifted the microphone again. There is no verified link between those concerns and Arden's current redevelopment. There will be, Marcus said firmly from his seat. The state has initiated formal review. The city council representative shifted uncomfortably. Lydia felt something unexpected rise within her. Not rage, not desperation. Courage. Clear and deliberate. This isn't about stopping progress, she said. It's about making sure progress isn't built on buried harm. Silence settled over the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then applause began. Tentative at first, then stronger. Claire's composure faltered slightly. We welcome transparency, she said, her tone tighter now. And we will cooperate fully with any state inquiry. The meeting ended without resolution. But the narrative had shifted. Outside, the air felt colder than before. Atlas barked once from the car when Lydia approached, tail wagging sharply as if sensing the change. She opened the door and knelt briefly to press her forehead against his. They heard us, she whispered. As she drove home, she noticed something new. Neighbors stood in small clusters on sidewalks talking. Phones held up, sharing information. The quiet isolation of the past week had fractured into collective awareness. Her house came into view at the end of the block. The shed stood silhouetted against the night sky. It no longer looked lonely. It looked defended. Inside, she set the stack of documents back on the kitchen table. Her hands trembled slightly, but from adrenaline now, not fear. The ticking had not stopped, but it no longer sounded solitary. It echoed. The morning after the town hall, Lydia woke to the vibration of her phone on the nightstand. Atlas lifted his head instantly, ears sharp. She reached for it, heart already racing. A news alert filled the screen. State Environmental Agency announces formal investigation into Arden redevelopment site. Her breath caught. She sat up slowly, reading every word. The agency confirmed that an objection had triggered mandatory soil testing and a temporary halt on further construction activity, pending review. Temporary halt. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. Atlas climbed halfway onto the bed, pressing against her as if he sensed the shift. It started, she whispered. Outside, the industrial skyline looked the same, but something invisible had changed. The cranes across the river stood motionless, their long arms frozen against the sky. By noon, our 2 state vehicles were parked along the perimeter fence of the old Arden property. Workers in reflective vests carried equipment into the fenced area. Yellow markers began appearing in neat rows across the dirt. Neighbors gathered at the corners of sidewalks, watching quietly. Lydia stood at her own fence, arms folded, Atlas beside her. She didn't cheer. She didn't speak. She simply watched. Marcus called mid-afternoon. They've officially paused grading operations, he confirmed. Testing begins today. And Claire? Lydia asked. Arden released a statement saying they support the investigation and remain confident in previous compliance. Of course they did. Marcus's tone softened. You handled the town hall well. I didn't plan it. Sometimes that's why it works. Lydia ended the call and stepped back inside, as the lean notice still sat in her kitchen drawer. 30 days had dwindled to 7. She hadn't forgotten. But something else arrived that week. A letter. Not anonymous. Not threatening. Official. State Environmental Agency. Preliminary findings. She sat at the kitchen table with Atlas at her feet and opened it carefully. Initial soil samples indicate elevated levels of industrial contaminants consistent with historic chemical disposal practices. Further comprehensive assessment required. Her vision blurred briefly. Confirmation. The word felt heavier than relief. That evening, Marcus visited in person. He placed a folder on the table. Based on confirmed contamination, affected homeowners are eligible for state remediation funds and potential class action compensation, he explained. This will take time, but it changes your financial position. How? She asked quietly. The lien against your home will likely be reconsidered if contamination affected property valuation, and Arden will face civil liability. Lydia let that settle. The ticking clock she had lived under for weeks slowed slightly. Construction remains halted, Marcus added. Arden has suspended redevelopment until further notice. Atlas's tail thumped once, suspended. The cranes across the river had not moved in 2 days. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. On the third evening after testing began, several neighbors knocked on Lydia's door. The older man from the town hall, a woman who had spoken about her garden, a young couple who had nearly signed contracts to buy into the redevelopment. We just wanted to say thank you, the woman said quietly. Lydia shook her head. It wasn't just me. But she felt the weight of what had shifted. The following week, formal notice arrived from the state. Full remediation required before any redevelopment may proceed. Arden Redevelopment withdrew its immediate construction permits. And then came the letter that made Lydia sit down slowly. Class Action Settlement Initiative. Preliminary approval. Affected property owners would receive compensation for diminished property value and health risk exposure, funded jointly by state oversight and Arden's insurance carriers. She read the number twice before it felt real. More than enough to clear the lien. More than enough to repair what had been quietly eroding beneath her home for decades. Atlas rested his chin on her knee again, at the same posture he had taken the day she opened the waterproof container. She ran her fingers through his fur. You found it, she said softly. Outside, the wind moved across the yard. The shed stood exactly where it had always stood, but it no longer looked weathered or abandoned. It looked preserved. Weeks passed. State crews continued soil assessment. Yard markers appeared and disappeared. Reporters came and went. Claire Benton did not return. Construction banners were quietly removed from the old Arden fence. One afternoon, Lydia walked to the edge of her yard and looked out toward the dormant site. The cranes remained still. Temporary fencing lined the perimeter. It felt like a collapse, but not of something she valued, of something hidden. She returned inside and placed the official settlement confirmation on the table. Atlas followed her closely, as he had every day since this began. The house felt lighter, not because the shed was gone, not because the pressure had vanished, but because the truth had surfaced, and it had held. 1 year later, the shed still stood at the edge of Lydia Mercer's yard. It no longer sagged. The rusted panels had been reinforced from the inside, sealed and stabilized, but she had insisted the exterior remain largely unchanged. The metal still bore its weathered stains. The roofline still dipped slightly at one corner. From the street, it looked exactly as it had the day she nearly tore it down. Only now, it was intentional. Inside, the transformation was quiet but unmistakable. The dirt floor had been leveled and replaced with sealed concrete. Insulated panels lined the interior walls, and a long wooden table stretched across one side, covered in neatly stacked folders and laminated information sheets. 2 folding chairs sat opposite it. A bulletin board displayed contact numbers for legal aid, environmental agencies, and housing advocates. Above the door hung a simple hand-painted sign. Owen's Corner. Atlas lay near the entrance, head up but relaxed, greeting each visitor with calm curiosity rather than suspicion. Lydia adjusted a stack of pamphlets on the table and stepped back to look at the space. A year ago, this shed had been an embarrassment, a liability, a source of irritation she carried alongside grief. Now it was something else entirely. The class action settlement had closed 6 months earlier. The funds cleared the lien on her home, covered remediation assessments, And left enough to create a small foundation dedicated to helping residents navigate property disputes and environmental claims. She hadn't planned to become anyone's advocate. But after the investigation, neighbors began knocking on her door anyway. Questions about paperwork, about deadlines, about rights they didn't realize they had. At first, she answered at the kitchen table. Then she moved the conversations to the shed. It felt right. Owen's old workbench remained in one corner, preserved exactly as he had left it. His measuring tools hung on a pegboard above it. The waterproof container sat on a shelf, empty now but never discarded. A framed copy of his original soil map rested beside it. The shed smelled faintly of fresh wood and paper. Her late afternoon sunlight filtered through a new skylight panel she had installed overhead. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beam. A car pulled into the driveway. Atlas rose smoothly, tail wagging once. "Go on," Lydia said gently. The dog trotted outside just as a middle-aged couple stepped onto the patio. They hesitated briefly at the sight of him, but Atlas's calm posture put them at ease. "You must be Mrs. Mercer," the woman said. "Lydia is fine." They entered the shed together. The couple explained their situation, another aging industrial property on the far side of town, facing redevelopment pressure, confusing notices, threats of eminent domain. Lydia listened without interrupting. She did not speak loudly. She did not dramatize. She asked questions, clarified timelines, and pointed to sections of state law pinned neatly to the board behind her. Atlas lay near her feet, eyes tracking each new arrival as if remembering his original discovery. After the couple left, Lydia remained seated at the wooden table for a moment. The yard was quiet. The old Arden site, visible faintly between rooftops, now bore signs of full environmental remediation. Heavy equipment moved deliberately, excavating soil under strict oversight. Progress this time looked different. She stood and walked to the workbench. Her fingers brushed across the worn surface where Owen had once leaned late at night, reviewing maps under a single bulb. "I get it now," she said softly. Not accusation, not regret. Understanding. He hadn't been keeping secrets from her. He had been preparing something for her. Preparing her. And Atlas patted over and rested his chin against the edge of the table. She smiled down at him. "If you hadn't scratched at that corner," she murmured. His ears twitched slightly. Outside, a group of neighborhood children rode bicycles down the sidewalk, laughter echoing lightly through the air. The shed door remained open. It no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like an invitation. Lydia stepped out onto the patio and looked back at the structure. For years, she had resented it, viewed it as stubbornness, as wasted space. She had mistaken preservation for neglect.
Now saying this does something quieter. Sometimes what looks like Kai is protection. Sometimes, if a peer forgotten is simply waiting. She climbed toward the house, the yard, the skyline beyond. The lives it had nearly abandoned remained in stark, not unchained, but stronger. Unless moved to stand beside her, calm and steady. Possessed de bois is merged, but it no longer carried weight, it carried purpose. And Lydia Mercer no longer short, it's as strong. She saw its address. The kind that doesn't sell, the kind that waits until someone is ready to uncover it. Because sometimes the thing we resent and the very thing quiet garden our future. And sometimes the courage isn't loud. It's seemingly refusing to look away when two breaches at the door. The chest does in Lydia are, gusty on the outside, steady on the inside. The quiet reminder that some two non so. They wait. Oh, and Sarah wasn't about hating something from her. It was about rotating something for hers. If you were in Lydia's place, would you have taken the offer and walk away, or stay and fought for the troops? Say your honest answer in the comment. And if story like this remind you that trend can come at any stage of life, stay with us for more journeys that uncover what's been waiting on.